Okay, hello and welcome, members of the Chinese Medicine Practitioner Meetup Group, hosted by Camel. My name is Thomas Leong. I'm the organizer of this group and your host for this afternoon or evening's events, depending on where you are. I want to take a moment to welcome all the new members to our group. I hope you enjoy what we have lined up tonight, and hopefully this is the first of many events to come. And the mission of our meetup group is to connect members with respected authorities on subject matters within our profession and to create a space where members of our community can come together and to learn from each other. The events are always free and our speaker suggestions come from you, the members. So if you have suggestions for future speakers, please send them to us. This is our 137th event in our, I guess, short, not so short history of the Chinese medicine group. So this is one of the older meetup groups. So I think that we should be very proud of that. By attending tonight, each of you will receive a $20 coupon via email. So please look for that email that be coming in the next couple of days. And if you don't see it, look in your spam box. Okay. So here's some ground rules. Please mute your microphones, but feel free. And I would even encourage you to leave the camera on. Past meetup surveys indicate that it's a moral boost to see other faces, when we do these meetups. So feel free to leave it on. You're decent, leave it on. Please hold off any questions until our guest speaker gives us the cue to ask the questions. And of course, there will be a Q&A session toward the end. But if it's something that's urgent, that's relevant, please type your comments in the chat box and raise your hand, and I, as your host, will address this. Tonight's lecture is about 1.5 hours, so it approximately ends 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And now, without further ado, let me introduce tonight's speaker, Julianne Nugent-Head. Julianne, after completion of a master's degree in Oriental Medicine in the United States and hospital internships in China during the summers of 2003 and 2004, Julianne moved to China full-time to document two of Beijing's most famous traditional practitioners, Dr. Li Hongxiang and Dr. Chen Tongyun. This exposure to classically based clinical medicine led Julianne to understand the naturalistic perspective and utter practicality of Chinese medicine in a new light. Encouraged by Dr. Li to complete doctoral level studies, Julianne's focused on classical perspective of herbs, investigating the flavor and nature of the herbal substance applied in the Shanhan Lun. After 8.5 years living in China, Julianne and husband Andrew returned to the United States due to changing visa and regulations for foreigners practicing medicine. Now residing in Asheville, North Carolina, Julianne treats patients at the Alternative Clinic, oversees development of the Appalachia Tea and Herb Farm, which is great, and teaches postgraduate herb programs in Zurich, London, and also Frankfurt. So on behalf of our group, we want to welcome Julianne to speak to us tonight. So I know online that this is how we do the clapping, right? We do this, I think. So if you can do that, that'd be great. And Julianne, welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, as Thomas said, I did spend time in China and was very fortunate to be accepted into the clinics of two traditional practitioners. And my time with them was really what clarified for me a traditional perspective and showed it to me in a clinical manner. So every time that I teach, I always want to take a moment and thank them for their incredible perspective and knowledge that they shared with me, and therefore allowed me to have something interesting and clinically relevant to share with you all. So thank you to Dr. Chen and the late Dr. Li Hongxiang. Today, this evening, I would like to talk about the concept of managing water, which I'm calling 8 classical strategies to affect dampness in our patients. Dampness is certainly among the more common diagnoses in Chinese medicine, as it's an interesting concept because it is both a cause of illness as well as a manifestation of illness. Dampness is something that we can see and diagnose quite easily in our patients. We can see its influence on the tongue. We can feel its influence in the pulse. We can even hear dampness in the sound of the voice of the patient, or see its influence leading to digestive disturbances, or heavy body sensations, or even deep and lingering fatigue. Dampness certainly is an easy thing to recognize, but it's not actually one of the most easy things to treat. And thus, I'd like to present some Chinese concepts on how to manage water that allows us to broaden our lens on treating dampness and hopefully thus receive more effective and reliable results in the clinic. So the first thing I'd like to say is that in order to understand dampness as a concept, we have to understand it simply is referring to a pathology of water. Water is not being managed properly, and thus it accumulates, and thus we call it dampness. But actually, water that is not being managed can take many various forms in various locations. This means that dampness could look different in many people and in different locations in one person. What I'm trying to say is we need to be clear that dampness is not actually one static thing. And thus how we will make a change in the body to resolve water pathology is not as simple as stating our patient has dampness and thus our treatment strategy is to simply resolve it. What we must be clear on is discerning how we will manage the water. And this is more important than conceptualizing dampness as a pathogen we have to eliminate. So I'm starting our brief discussion by suggesting that we first reframe dampness as simply water that must be managed, or water that is not being managed. And secondly, we need to recognize that water may appear in various forms and concentrations, leading to varied manifestations, and thus requiring varied treatment strategies. Now, I just mentioned that in the body, water may take various forms. In nature, we know that this is true. Water can appear as a solid or a liquid or a gas. And how it acts and works and affects the things around it is quite relative to whether it is a solid or a liquid or a gas. And we really can't extrapolate that the same is true in the human. Water in liquid form is important in places where it is needed, but actually could be quite disastrous in places where it's not. Water as a vapor is an important concept and a component of the atmosphere, but water vapor can cause damage when it settles in places that it should not reside. Water as a solid is crucial to regulate our ocean temperature and our air currents. But if water quickly turns to solid or should be solid and is not, then we know that the water levels rise. The tree limbs can suddenly break and crack. Water that freezes within the cells of a plant will burst and rupture that cell. So water is a crucial element to life and development on the planet, and the changes or the phases of water are equally important. Nature relies on these shifts and these changes, what we call the cycle of water. But we also rely on a state of balance where water is in the correct phase, in the correct place, in the correct concentration. if water is too much or too little, it moves too fast or moves too slow, is a gas when it should be a liquid or a liquid when it should be a solid. This leads to damage and destruction. And the same is true for water in the human. When it is in a place that it should not be, in a concentration or collection that it should not be, or a form that is not optimal, that leads to illness. And we may diagnose that as dampness. But our job, perhaps more than saying we are thus treating dampness, is to manage the water, which means that we have to get that water into the optimal form and concentration in the optimal portion of the body. Thus, jumping from an analogy of nature into our bodies, it's easy to consider the body's inside like a landscape of varied climates. For example, the tissues inside the sinus should have a very thin mucous membrane. Yet the fluid should never be congealed and collected to get stuck. Neither is it optimal if it is watery and copious enough to drip out. The kidneys and the bladder, in comparison, are designed to hold and filter actual liquid and to process it and remove it from the body. The water in those organs should be flowing and wet. And so the water must be neither too hot nor too cold, too thick or too viscous. But as the optimal state of water in the nose is not the optimal state of water in the kidneys, the optimal state of water in the stomach is also not the optimal climate of the spleen. As we all know, as Chinese medicine practitioners, we say that the spleen abhors dampness, while the stomach abhors dryness. The lungs, the heart, the joints, the muscles, each location's optimal climate is actually a bit different. And thus, varied microclimates within our body means that water in its optimal state is not the same state everywhere, which also means that managing water or treating dampness in our patients means we must be clear when our strategy is global versus when we are affecting a very narrow region. And this is often the trickiest thing to consider when treating dampness in a patient, for example, who has dampness in one place while they have dryness in another. So before we can discuss what to do and have some wonderful Chinese vocabulary to guide our thinking process, I would like to use a few pictures from nature to show us how water can look different in different places and help us to conceptualize what it means to be managing water. So I'm going to click some buttons and share my screen here. It's not giving me the option that it was before to share that.
You have to go back into presenter view.
Oh, I need to go presenter view. Sorry, hold on a second. Presenter view. Sorry, let me just press this button. Aha. Okay. So here is a picture of thick fog blocking the view of the trees behind. If we use this picture as an analogy for water pathology in the body, we can see that it's as if the body has a mist or a fog. If this mist or fog was in the head and the sinuses, it is reasonable that the fog would be confusing the mind, creating stuffiness in the nose or the sinus. If this picture represents the climate inside the head, we could see that the orifices would actually be clouded or fogged. They would be blocked. The person may not hear clearly. They may not be able to see very clearly. They may have a muffled sound to their voice. They may seem confused or have headaches, full sensations. Even the skin may be puffy. And while we could say to the patient that they have dampness, this is not dampness that they are able to blow out of their nose or just drain out of their ear. In Chinese medicine, we have a condition called phlegm misting the mind, which sounds really esoteric, but phlegm misting the mind looks actually quite like this picture. It literally is a mist that's blocking clarity. Now, if this picture represents a landscape of fog in the middle jiao, we could understand that the appetite, the absorption, the elimination would be quite affected. The tongue may also be puffy. The belly may certainly be bloated. The person may feel heavy and queasy and have a low appetite. The digestion would be affected as the absorption and the movement of foodstuffs would certainly be impaired if there was this kind of fog in the digestive organs. Imagine this landscape and then receiving food. The clear yang qi cannot easily rise, and the turbid yin cannot easily descend. Things just get stuck in there, kind of like being lost in the fog. And it actually matters less what foods are put into the digestion, tofu or bean sprouts and kale, or the best macrobiotic, organic, what have you. Any food entering this landscape would not sit well and would not digest well and would not be absorbed well in order to be deeply nourishing the human. I think it's not unreasonable for a person with this kind of digestive landscape to have food sensitivities, poor stools, tongue coating, weight loss, or weight gain. They certainly may also have mental fog symptoms. And when the digestion feels off due to fog or humidity that looks like this, it's not unreasonable that the patient may begin to look for the culprit, like gluten or soy or meat or dairy. It's not unlikely that they could be diagnosed with candida or told that they have molds. But the culprit really is this idea of a humid, foggy landscape in the digestive system. This is humidity and fog in places that should not have fog. It's a fog that leads to poor function, and that means that what goes in doesn't fully come out. This picture can also show us how spread out the moisture is, all the way from the ground to the sky. If this type of fog or humidity is in the whole body, it's like a mist in the channels, in the orifices, in the joints, and even in the organs. And so how we would manage this water is quite relative to this form that it presents. It is not liquid that can just be drained out. We cannot easily blow it out the nose. We cannot easily pee it out. Fog like this may also not change much. Using this picture as an analogy for water pathology in the body that is like a mist or a fog, it's not unexpected that the patient may think that they have gluten sensitivities or soy or meat or dairy. It's not unlikely that a patient may be told that they have candida or have mold exposure. because they're looking for answers. Why are things not digesting well? But the culprit really is the humid landscape in the digestive system, in a place that it shouldn't be humid. Remember that we are saying in Chinese medicine that the spleen abhors dampness. It doesn't want to have a damp climate in order to work well. So it is really the fog that is the problem, irrespective of what we put inside of the body, that things would not be digested well. This picture also shows us how spread out the moisture could be. So for example, here in this image, there's moisture from the ground all the way to the sky. And so if this type of fog or humidity is in the entire body, it could be mist within the channels or in the flesh or in the joints. It can be blocking the orifices or even into the organs. How we manage this water is quite relative then to the form that it's presenting. It's not a liquid that could be simply drained out. We can't blow it out the nose or pee it out. And fog like this may not change by choosing a formula or herbs that are tonifying to the spleen. Because this type of fog often needs to be transformed. We need to change it back to a clear vapor. The way that the sun comes out and changes the cool morning fog back into clear gas. In the body, this means that we have to get this idea of fog as the proper moisture into the tissues, not mist lingering in the empty spaces. And let me press a button here, okay? In this next picture, you can see water is acting differently. This is clouds that are rolling low over the ground. And even though this image is not water in a liquid form, we can see movement within the clouds. They are following the contours of the earth. They're traveling low across the surface. But it's also moisture settling down, gathering and flowing over the hills, despite there being clear and crisp air above. I chose this picture to illustrate how moisture could settle downward and gather in the low areas, in the places where the qi does not move as well, in the nooks and crannies of our body. I chose this picture also to illustrate how moisture can settle into the legs, can flow and settle into the joints, into the cul-de-sacs of the fingers and our toes. If fog like this settles into the lower jiao, it could lead to heavy sensations of the legs or the pelvis, distension of the lower abdomen, scanty or blocked urination, cloudy urination or discharge. If the fog settles into our joints, our movements would feel stiff and heavy. The fog would block the flow of qi and blood. And we can see in this image how a slight breeze helps move the clouds low. And it helps to conceptualize the idea of wind and damp in the body. Wind that is slowly pushing moisture along, deep into our pockets and cavities. This analogy also reminds us that despite having fog or cloud low along the ground, the clouds are not everywhere. There is clear sky, and this happens in the body as well. There can be areas where there are damp and areas concurrently where there are dry. So this shows us this idea that in nature, the landscape can have both. Our third image here is again quite different. Everything in this picture is soaking. It's saturated. It's soggy. If this is the example that we apply to the human, this represents a pervasively wet systemically wet landscape. If you can imagine this inside the body, think of how little airflow there is in this sopping wet place. Every tissue is soaking and steeping in wetness, which would make the tissue and the organs more prone to mold, growth of fungus, sores, and edema. I chose this image to represent dampness everywhere, and also to remind us that how we would affect this level of water would be quite different from the first two examples. So what I'm attempting to show in just 3 pictures of water in nature is that water does look different and act different in nature. Different concentrations, different locations, different phases and influencing upon its surroundings. And these are just 3 examples. There are so many more varieties of water pathology in nature and certainly in the body. But I hope that 3 examples have presented the concept of how varied water can be, and thus how varied damp pathology could be in the body. So dampness really is a word that we use to describe water pathology. And thus we must consider what form or phase the water is in order to affect it. For example, are we looking at humidity in the body, leading to muddled thinking, muddled seeing, or muddled hearing? Are we seeing sinus blockages and digestive symptoms, heavy body and fatigue, illustrated by that misty everywhere kind of picture? Humidity like that is often, we can see its influence, but we can't necessarily see it. It is not liquid water. It cannot be removed from the nose or peed out. That type of humidity needs to be enlivened, often using aromatic and fragrant or warm natured herbs. On a humid day, we often desire a breeze to make the air move and make our bodies feel more light. And in the body, we need the same idea. We need to enliven the chi. We need to make movement, as if moving the mist. We may need to warm up the water to turn it back to a clear gas, like the sun warming up the morning fog. In comparison, water that is liquid or tangible fluid in the body can often be drained out, or chased out, or exited from the body. Liquid is a form that is more tangible, visible, and thus is a substance that can leave. This is a situation where there could be too much, and therefore we can pour it out. And we can exit it, perhaps through the urine or the feces. Comparing that to phlegm, phlegm is certainly a phase of water, and it also has to be treated differently. When our body fluids have become thick or condensed, or in a place where they should not be, we often have to transform that phlegm back into its proper liquid form. Sometimes that means softening and dissolving the phlegm that has become dry and sticky. But if the phlegm is quite wet and copious, we may actually, in contrast, have to dry and reduce it. So how we affect phlegm is actually quite relative to its qualities of phlegm. But it also has to be transformed or changed to get it back into its optimal fluidness. The last line on this slide is the concept of ice, or cold static fluids. And certainly we may not have actual ice in the body, but we can't understand how the body fluids and the tissues would be affected by cold, what that would do to the movement of water. When there's cold, that means that fluids do not flow well. They become more condensed. They pool in places that they shouldn't. The blood could become more thick. the tissues contract, the layers of the body become more stiff, and the body can actually become quite rigid. There's often palpable pain and cold sensations. And so our treatment of water that's not moving due to cold is often to deeply warm and stimulate movement to affect the water that has stopped being managed. And these are the very concepts that the ancients understood when they wrote formulas of old and designed strategies to manage water. On this slide are 8 action phrases, if you will, in Chinese, that I hope will start to shape our thinking and guide our treatment strategies. So we have shun shi, or to leach and seep out dampness, li shui, to flow or uninhibit the water, to li niao, or to tong lin, to flow and to benefit the urine or to unblock lin conditions, to chu shui, or to expel the water, which is quite different than the concept of zao shi, to dry the dampness. I've used this word transform a couple of times already, to hua shi or to hua tan, transforming dampness versus transforming phlegm, or to pai shi or pai nong, to get out the water, or to separate or expel pus and nodules. Now, you may have already heard these terms before, but today I really would like to stress them as the key to our treatment strategy to manage water. How we are treating water is really guided by these actions. When we are writing a formula or choosing a formula, are we focusing on herbs that are leaching or seeping the fluids out of the body? Or are we turning to herbs that are powerfully expelling fluids? Those are very different concepts. Are we transforming dampness as if we're turning moisture back into clear air? Or are we drying the dampness as if the hot sun on a clothing line? These different action words are not semantical. It really requires different treatment methods, different herbal choices. So we really have to pay attention to the actions of these words. These words also help us to understand the speed of change and the potency of our formula. For example, leach is a passive term. Leach means the water can seep downward through the soil, sort of on its own timeline, on its own path. Water seeps out, which means that herbs that are said to leach or seep water are often much more slow in effect or less potent. It's a passive action. Expel water, in contrast, means actively pushing water out. If our aim is to expel something, the patient will see water actually exiting. And they should know that that is our aim of treatment, to actually have the water leave the body. The patient needs to know to expect perhaps an exciting or a more watery stool, an increase in urination in frequency or volume. Perhaps they should be expecting to see sweat as the indication of change, or maybe even vomiting out the water as our aim of expelling. Sorry, I'm trying to scroll down here. Oh, there we are. Okay. Transform, in contrast, doesn't mean we're expecting water to exit from the body at all. Rather, we are changing it. To transform dampness means to make it into not dampness. The fog becomes clear. The slight queasy of the belly goes away. The slight congestion of the head resolves. But we didn't actually exit water from the body, we changed it. Each situation requires a treatment that matches the location of the water pathology and the phase of water in that location. Using these vocabulary words to guide our strategy, we are guided to choose herbs and formulas differently, perhaps, than stating that we are going to treat damp or choose formulas or acupoints that treat damp. For example, on the next slide, we have herbs that are said to leach or seep out dampness. And most of the herbs that are on this slide are bland substances. The Huangdi Neijing tells us that bland flavored herbs are able to seep or leach, inhibit, and create flow or benefit by creating this flow. But leach is a passive term. And so the action of these herbs in particular is much more passive. The flavor and the nature of these herbs is neutral and bland. And so everything about them in terms of their quality and their action is more passive. Bland is actually not a lack of flavor, but rather a yinnish, starchy flavor. Bland is not no taste, but perhaps bland is represented by the starchy viscosity of a well-cooked rice gruel. So this bland, starchy quality of the herbs lends to a sort of a thickness of the herbal tea, a viscousness, a heavy yinnishness, and therefore the herbal tea sort of seeps and descends and leaches through the body. When we use these herbs, we are settling down the qi like osmosis. And that viscous blandness guides qi downward and water with it, somewhat like osmosis, that things can start to settle, descending down. This explains why the herbs are also said to settle the qi and calm the spirit, because they are moving downwards slowly. And yet in a passive way, we are lessening the water. If there is sluggish gathering qi and gathering yin, it also will settle down. As single herbs, these herbs are great substances to consider for sensitive patients or for long-term use because they are mild, like food or supplements. Most of them are upper herbs in the Shandong Bancao, which means that they are not powerful or toxic. The Shandong Bancao tells us that upper herbs are able to be prescribed in large doses for long periods of time without harming the person. So this is great, but it also means that they are not inherently creating quick changes because they are inherently subtle. And so if a patient is damp in one place, but dry in another place, these herbs are great to consider because they aren't inherently over drying compared to many of the other herbs we will speak about this evening. In a formula, because these herbs are mild and bland in quality, they are often potentiated in effect with other herbs. For example, in Wuling San, the warming and sweet acrid of guizhi and the warm, bitter drying of baiju will overall warm and dry the system, while the fuling, the juling, and the zuxia can seep out the water. An herb like fuling may be mild enough that it has to be combined with powerful herbs like huangqi and fangji if the situation is much more profound. But if the patient is really sick or weak, these mild herbs may be the best choice simply because they are so mild. The key thing to remember about these herbs, in my opinion, is that they are mild and neutral in quality and thus rather passive in action. And as one of our strategies to manage water, these herbs are labeled as seep and leach. When we look at these herbs on the picture, we can see that they are dense herbs. They are heavy in their plant nature. That yinish quality assists that action of affecting flow in a downward descending manner. This picture shows their white color and their bland, starchy insides, but it doesn't really represent their bland, starchy flavor. If everyone can think about having a bowl of congee or oatmeal with no flavorings or goodies in it, it's like that for these herbs. They aren't affecting the body loudly with a bitter flavor or an acrid flavor. They are very benign, and thus they affect that qi in a seeping, leaching manner. As they are not inherently warm or cold, if warming the yang is a focus of treatment, they may need to be combined with herbs that do create a warming effect, for example, in Wuling Zhen. If they need to be combined with herbs for a more cooling effect, or when a patient is quite ill or postpartum, we can do that. And they are great base level herbs to combine with things when the patient's yin is of a concern. For example, in the formula Zhuling Tang. These herbs can also be combined with bitter herbs for a more active or draining effect. And they are excellent herbs to consider in managing water as a building block, for their mild qualities lends to safety and allows us to choose other herbs to customize the formula for each patient. Here on this slide, we have herbs that are said to unblock and course and flow. These herbs are being ascribed a more active vocabulary. The term is unlock, unblock, make flow. These herbs are often considered diuretics. They actually do encourage urination. They aren't toxic, but many of them are middle level herbs from the Shen Nong Ban Cao, which indicates a use to treat symptoms and prevent a condition from worsening. And the Shen Nong Ban Cao tells us that middle level substances should be used carefully when needed and ceased when they are no longer necessary. These herbs encourage a more robust urination, sort of like the difference between a tiny little trickle or having a flow like a river. When there's only a tiny stream of water, the flow may not be powerful enough to move away the sediment and the leaves and the branches that are stuck. Whereas when the river is very forceful, sediment does not gather along the banks. So using that analogy, these herbs are encouraging a more robust urination with the direct result of pushing away or getting out what is stuck in the ducts. If someone has sediment in the urinary tract or the bladder or the kidney, we want to push out the sediment. And so these herbs are said to have that more active effect in this manner. The concept of a Lin condition in Chinese medicine is that there is a blockage, whether it is a blood blockage or stone or damp or cold. So the action word li niao, or to flow or uninhibit the urine, means that we use these herbs to create flow in the urination, but also we can think of them in service of getting out the sediment or unblocking the pathway, which is quite different action-wise from a more passive seeping out of water. So these herbs are more potent, and they have a purpose that, again, should not be in a formula theoretically long-term. We can see a picture of these herbs here, and the quality of these herbs is worth mentioning, that they are mostly bland and neutral quality substances. But we can see here one line of seeds that are small. Seeds can get into things as if to help move the sediment away. On the right side, we also have the very lightweight quality of the herbs. We have the super light airiness of tongsao. We have the mutong, even mutong that has tiny holes you can see through it. So the very light quality of them allows them to flow and get into things. And then these herbs many of them have a light bitter flavor. And so the bitter flavor also allows them to drain and flow in a more active way. What's also unique about these herbs is they have a slight sweetness to them, a little bit of a sensation of creating a slip or a lubrication for its flowing action. If you think about a stone that's passing through a straw, it's very hard and quite painful for something hard to be passing through a narrow corridor. And so we could understand needing to use herbs that have a light, slippery, sweet nature to help flow and not allow the sediment to get stuck. In a formulation, we may need to pair these herbs with something that is more palpably warming or aromatic, if warming and stimulating the yang qi is an important part of treatment. For example, in the formula Dangui Sinitan. Whereas if heat and irritation has led to blockages and a lack of flow, we could pair these herbs with cold and bitter things to cool and move, like in the formula Bajangsen. These are excellent building blocks in a formula to create flow in the water, and we can pair these herbs with other things that are appropriate for each patient. On this slide, this group of herbs is titled herbs that eliminate or expel. And we can see that action word eliminate, which is a word that we will often see in formulas when dampness is lodged in the flesh. Applying the acrid, spicy, flowing qualities of these herbs expels dampness in the channels. They are warm, they are acrid, they are more powerful herbs, and they flow and expel as if they push out the dampness. The image that comes to mind as I was writing this is like when you're in a car wash and you're driving through, and at the end they have the super powered hot air blower. That kind of warmth and movement that scatters and moves through the channels. If any of you are familiar enough to think of the smell of duhuo or qianhuo, that smell alone exemplifies the qualities of these herbs. How something that is warm and spicy can scatter and move and eliminate dampness and cold from the body. These herbs are also, most of them are woody substances and vines. In nature, their purpose is to flow and deliver nutrient up and down through the tree. The tissue of the tree is actually quite like our muscles and sinews. And we use woody substances and vines in that same way, powerfully flowing into the channels and into the flesh. Many of these herbs are powerful enough that we do need to be careful of using them long term. Because herbs that flow and expel, that are warm and scattering and spicy, don't just move water, they move the qi, they move the blood. This is excellent for getting into the flesh, flowing through the joints, alleviating B syndromes. But that means that these herbs can be quite drying and irritating long term. When we look at the qualities of these herbs, we can see the top line of thin, viney types of things. Togucao, Weilingxian, Haifangtang. The word tongue means vine, and the quality of a vine in nature, how something can clamber on and get into and hook in, lends to a quality of that plant acting in the human. The lower row of images here on the slide shows us the woody qualities of songjia and mugua and duhuo. These herbs are potent, and they do get the job done, often quickly. They are great building blocks in formulas to quickly expel damp and flow in the channels. But they are very acrid and warm and quite drying. And thus the formula should be written for the patient at hand and their level of moisture and dryness in other places. Because dampness in the channels may appear with dryness on the skin, for example. So we need to balance our formula accordingly. In this category, we also see the action word eliminate. But these herbs are more cooling than flowing. Quite similar to the herbs on the last slide, they are vines, wood pieces, and most of them are acrid herbs. So the simple difference between acrid and warm and acrid and cool is an important distinction to make. Acridity is important to get into the nooks and crannies. The Huangdi Jing tells us that it is the acrid flavored substances that are able to create movement, are able to scatter. So we want that acrid quality to make the movement in the flow. Kind of like the picture of the clouds moving across the contours. We want wind to move it. We don't want dampness to settle in and lodge into the joints or into the organs. And sometimes we need a bit of bitter in the formula. But we can turn to herbs with an acrid and cool nature when we need to expel damp from the channels, but are concerned about overwarming or over drying. These herbs on this slide are said to transform dampness. Transform is an interesting vocabulary word. It does mean that we are changing something from one form to another. It doesn't mean expel. It doesn't mean kick out or purge or dry or drain. It doesn't actually mean we are moving or scattering or seeping. It literally means we have changed its form. We need to change dampness into not dampness. These herbs are able to change dampness through their incredibly aromatic properties. The essential oils in these herbs are often the most noticeable properties. If you can think about the smell of patchouli, the unbelievable penetrating, lingering, oily nature of patchouli oil, not only is strong enough that it became a favored oil to cover up bad body odor, but it is a famous substance for going into the body and being so aromatic in the digestion that it's not just transforming mild humidity, but the fetidness and the dampness of severe food poisoning and cholera kinds of things, serious illness in there. Huoxiang Zhengqi is an excellent example of a formula that uses incredibly aromatic herbs to transform that dampness and turbidity and to rectify the qi. The qi can recover when the dampness is transformed. So the strong fragrance of these herbs not only penetrates into the dampness, but it enlivens it. It gets what is congested to start to move. And when we look at the herbs that are on here, we have the incredible aromatic of the Huoxiang, but also we have the herbs from cardamom families, the Caodoukou and the Rodoukou and the Baidoukou, and we have Sharen. Smelling that is enough to add those herbs to digestive formulas where someone's formula is not robust. A little bit of this enlivens. Here we have a picture of these herbs. And while we can see some of them are seeds, which makes sense when we open up a seed and it releases its incredible aroma, what is really not well represented by this picture is the incredible aromatic property that makes these herbs transform the dampness. Magnolia bark certainly is something that we can smell just from having the herb near us. Even the light aroma of Peilan helps to transform damp without being too warming. Patchouli or huaxiang. When I lived in Beijing during the summer, huaxiang would all of a sudden be in 70% of the formulas for the population because so many people were consuming cooling things, iced things during the summer to cool off. And so they would have cold and damp within the body while the skin and the outside was quite hot from summer. And so it was a very common ingredient to add to formulas for the season that ended up affecting everyone with damp conditions. We also have on this slide, I actually have a picture of Baiju to represent Cangzhu, because when I went to take a picture of our Cangzhu, we had none, but the smell of Cangzhu has this incredible orangey aroma, this warming and drying fragrance. And it makes sense that if the stomach was a little queasy and damp, this idea of warm kind of orange citrus family, that kind of aroma to enliven it. So these herbs really are aromatizing, if you will, the moisture. Because often when we have to transform it, it means, again, that it's not just liquid. It's not something that we can just pee out. We have to change it. And so these herbs will have that aromatic effect. But as they affect the moisture, they also have that aromatic effect upon the qi and the blood and the yin as well. Hopewell, for example, is often in formulas where the qi is congested in the chest. We're creating this movement of the qi to enliven and to relieve constraint. Now, in order to create a formula with these herbs, these are excellent building blocks, but we need to be aware of their incredibly aromatic and potentially drying natures. We can use small amounts as if it's an aromatic or kind of a digestif to stimulate the appetite, kind of like combining orange and bitters. If we feel that our formula needs to be profoundly warm, then these are great building blocks to add to things like fresh or dried ginger, certainly cinnamon, those kinds of things. If we feel that our formula needs to be more cooling and aromatic, then these also can be added to herbs that are lighter and more venting and cooling. Things like boha is commonly seen with these. On this slide, these herbs are labeled as herbs that uninhibit dampness and recede yellowing conditions. And what that really means is that there's dampness in the body obstructing proper functioning of the liver and the gallbladder. And basically what we're talking about is a jaundiced condition. So in this idea, the herbs are creating movement so that the water stops being a block, so that the organs can function properly. They can sort of get into dampness and make it flow to stop the dampness from blocking the pathways. So when we use these herbs, yin chen hao or jin qian cao or hu zhang or chui pen cao, we aren't necessarily exiting the damp from the body either. We aren't necessarily going to see a longer pee or water coming out of the nose. We are getting the dampness to move. And as these herbs do tend to be quite drying, they are often good when the damp is more wetness, where it's more liquidy. These herbs are cold and bitter, but they're actually very light in their plant quality, almost as if they sop up the dampness. And once they get the water to be moving or flowing or dried, the liver and the gallbladder function optimizes, and thus the yellowing resolves. We can see these herbs here in this picture this light, incredibly fluffiness of yin shen hao and the lightness of jin shan sao, that these herbs are able to almost go in and soak it up. And then hujiang, it doesn't look quite as light in quality when it's sitting next to yin shen hao and jin shan sao, but hujiang, when you hold it in your hand, also is not a particularly dense herb. So it does have this ability to go in and sort of sop up and clear dampness like this. So these herbs are great in formulation when we certainly see the idea of dampness leading to yellowing or jaundice. These are things that we can think of right away. And then they can be combined with herbs that make the formula more cooling, if that is what we need to do, if there is heat and dampness blocking the liver or gallbladder, or they could be combined with herbs that are much more warming if the dampness is more cold. Things like ginger certainly are frequent combinations with these. The herbs on this slide are categorized as clear heat and dry damp herbs. And I think these herbs are probably the most famous herbs people think of when treating dampness. I think most often when diagnosing dampness, practitioners feel they have the option to tonify the spleen or drain damp. But I want us to note that so far, we have talked about bland flavors being able to seep out or leach damp. We've talked about aromatic flavors being able to enliven and transform damp or transform phlegm. We've spoken about acrid flavors moving and expelling dampness and flowing and pushing damp out of the channels. And even the last slide of herbs that uninhibited and cleared the organs through the lightness of their plant quality. And yet only now are we arriving at herbs that dry dampness and clear heat, which may be the herbs that many practitioners turn to first. So when we diagnose dampness from this moment onwards, I hope this illustrates that there are many flavors to consider, which is especially poignant with bitter herbs, because in my practice, I see many people diagnosed with gut dysbiosis, or SIBO, or candida, or mold toxicity, and they are prescribed these bitter cold herbs. Or they are prescribed berberine pills, Oregon grape, herbs that bind with molds, or herbs that kill candida. And often the cold bitter of these herbs are incredibly damaging to the patient's system. It is true that the patient may have damp, but now we know there are multiple options on how to affect it. In this category, the herbs are palpably intensely bitter. They literally dry up the dampness, soak it up. The damp is gone from the intense bitter. The last time we drank Huangbai in the clinic, all of us had chapped lips and dry mouths and dry stomachs. And we all started to wonder, where did the dampness go? Where did our natural water go? It just was gone from that intense bitter. So they are really effective in treating dampness, but they are really incredibly drying. So to use these herbs, there has to be enough pathogenic water that the herbs can dry the water and not dry up the human's yin, good yin, or their tissues. There often has to be enough heat in the body that we aren't damaging the person by our cold herbs. These herbs are often very successful for acute situations where dampness has led to toxicity, where damp is getting fetid, where the heat and the dampness is becoming festering And often this means they have to be loud, that we use for only short periods of time. The following analogy I want to share when discussing why I want people to be careful turning to these herbs long-term is here in Asheville, it is a temperate rainforest. We get so much rainfall and constant moisture that in my brand new house, we run a dehumidifier in the basement all the time. One room in our basement is completely underground. It's covered by 3 sides of ground. And the room right next to it is open air, and we have a sliding glass door to go walk outside at ground level. If we don't run a dehumidifier in the back room, everything in that room would grow mold. If we constantly ran the dehumidifier in the open air part of the basement, drying out that air would crack the flooring. One room is prone to humidity, while the room next to it is less. One room does not have any good airflow, no light, and has more, it's more closed in. It's enclosed. The moisture can settle. The room right next to it is not as prone because it has fresh air and movement. So we have to change the environment to keep it dry and warm, to prevent what we keep in that room, which happens to be our storeroom, from rotting. And yet the mold is not a pathogen. It's not toxic or evil. The mold that would grow in that room is the natural result of something that's able to grow in that optimally moist climate. What if instead of using a dehumidifier, we just went in once a month and sprayed the walls with mold killer, to kill everything that had grown? Would you want to do that repeatedly to the house you live in? Would you want to sleep in the room where you had done that? And yet, how many of our patients that are being diagnosed with damp or mold need their landscape changed like the warm and drying dehumidifier instead of the cold, bitter herbs like spraying bleach upon the walls? So what I'm trying to say is these herbs are exceptional and very helpful when we need them, but they should not be considered the only strategy for damp. So here is our pictures of herbs with things that are very yellow and are incredibly bitter. These are so bitter that they are named for being bitter. And I want us to remember that these herbs are right now so commonly used to treat candida and gut issues, but we really have seen so many other options of treatment. And I hope that that helps you think more broadly about managing water. So I'd like to return to these action words, and perhaps this gives us a broader lens to consider treatment strategies and our formula makeups when diagnosing dampness in our patients. So thank you for joining me in this short discussion. And thank you so much for Camo for supporting not just this meetup, but for herbs in general, for being an excellent source that provided certainly us and I don't know how many of you with herbs all through the pandemic and many of the things that you can see here. So thank you to Camo. And that is where I will end, and we will then open the floor to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Julianne. That was very informative. And I'm sure that we all learned a lot from that. And so that concludes the lecture portion of it. And then we're going to move on to the Q&A. Before we do that, we just want to, on behalf of the group, we just want to thank you for your time and the good work that you and Andrew and the whole your herb farm and the classes, the education you're providing in North Carolina, and of course nationwide too, because People fly in, and I think you also have online classes as well, right? Correct?
We do, yes,
Yeah,
yes, we
great.
do.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So if you have questions for Julianne, you can just raise your hand and then, and I'll call on you and then you can unmute and then we'll start the Q&A session. Anyone have any questions? Oh, all right, everything's so clear. Okay.
Boris says he has a question.
Boris has a question. All right, Boris, why don't you unmute?
So my question is about kind of bidirectionality. For example, I have some patients who are, very overweight, lots of edema in the legs, where but clearly they're young they have symptoms of cold, but they have this really acute and intense, lower leg edema. And, I'm hesitant using cold bitter herbs alone. How do you figure out how to balance like the lifting everything up enough so that it can drain out? I know when I'm looking at it, I especially if we take into consideration this analogy of the dampness sort of seeping in and down, like how do we lift it up high enough above the orifices so that it could fall out of the right orifices? It's obviously not going to like drain out every bottom of the
Not out of the toe. We can't just tap it out of the toe. I think, certainly when you look at formulas that are treating, especially edema of the lower body, often what we're seeing is really powerful acrid and warm herbs. And their herbs, the first herb that comes to mind is duhua. And the beauty of comparing duhua and qianghua is duhua is said to be the herb that moves and scatters in the lower part of the body, whereas qianghua is said to be its kind of counterpart that moves and scatters more in the upper part of the body. And I think we can understand that because qianghua is actually very, very light in quality when you hold it in its hand, and it's so much more spicy and hot. It tends to act in a more yangish, upwardly moving way, whereas duhua has a little bit more of an earthy smell, and it's a little more dense when you hold it in your hand. It has a little bit more yinish quality as actually a plant substance, and therefore it does lend to being able to affect the lower part of the body, to sink more into the legs. So its flavor in nature creates movement and flowing and warming and drying, getting out that idea of edema, which is very appropriate, especially if the person has a lot of cold and you're concerned about their yin or their yang. But its plant nature has a yinish quality that allows it to get to the feet. And, that's something that when we look at a lot of the herbs that are said to be guides to the head or to the knees or things like that, we have to ask, well, what about that plant makes it a guide to the knee for Neoshi or something, for example. And often it is the density of it, it's the quality of the actual plant substance, that it has that yin ability to sink or settle or move downward. So for your example, I would be much more inclined to write a formula that was actually hot and scattering to move water and drying, and then make sure that the herbs that I'm using have some weight to them to go more downward as opposed to going up to the head. Great two herbs to compare side by side in flavor tasting is qianghua compared to duhua, because it is so palpable, the upward powerful of qianghua and the more weighted down of duhua. And then how I would balance it with your patient is, if I am so hot and scattering, do I need something like lugun to protect any yin so that I don't dry out the mouth? Often that's why maybe a little bit of Maimendong or even sometimes Dazao or Gansao is included in the formula so that we are creating powerful movement, but not over drying the other tissues. So that's at least where I would start with that. And maybe I'm not understanding the question well, but it sounds to me more like if the edema is in the lower part of the body, we still want to use a lot of acrid and warm herbs to affect it.
Yes, that helps me understand. Thank you.
Mhm.
Great. I see that Daniel Spiegelman, if you can.
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Julianne.
Hi, Daniel.
I've got a question about mugwa.
Yes,
As it's a sour herb,
yeah,
I've kind of struggled or just thought about why it has this sort of affinity with dampness, and I came
Yeah.
across Ye Tianshi said the sour flavor gives it an affinity with the liver, and then so the tendons, so it kind of will get that warmth. I'm paraphrasing him, but get it into the tendons and clear them out that way. Is that how you conceive
yes,
of it
you know,
as well?
I think mugwa is an excellent question, because when you lay all of the herbs that are in that chapter specifically side by side, you can see that almost all of them have this quality of woodiness and vininess, including mugwa. But what mugwa has that's unique is that sour flavor. And if we're going to say that it's the acrid and the warmth that's flowing, what the heck is going on with sour? So the first thing is, I feel like it's a little bit of a dot in the Taiji that most of the herbs are working like that, and that mugwa does have a warm and a woody flowing nature, but that its sour is somewhat kind of almost collecting the water as it goes, pulling it in a little bit so that it can manage it. As well as, I agree with that, what Ye Tianshi said is that why is there dampness, right? We have to back up to some extent, the idea of that there's a pathology between the liver and the spleen. And so when there's an excess situation in the liver, often the spleen is affected. And so the mugwa is perhaps kind of one step removed from the dampness to diagnosing the cause of the dampness as, are we affecting the liver so that the liver is calmed and soured and gathered, and thus the spleen is able to recover and is not insulted by the liver. So I think it's great for you that jumped out at you as a bit of a like, that one doesn't make sense. That's, I think, the best thing we can do as practitioners is to have a good sense of investigation and find things that don't seem like they easily match, and then ask questions about it. And those are my thoughts on why mugwa in particular in that category.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you for your question, Daniel. And then we have Lauren. You unmute to ask your question.
Hi, Julianne.
Hi, Lauren.
Would you speak a little bit more about the differentiation between, I guess, formed and unformed dampness, and specifically what that would look like in a patient?
Sure. I think formed or unformed dampness. The first thing that comes to my mind is I would be listening for a sound, right? The difference, we've had suddenly a lot of coughs here in Asheville. And so listening, cough is an excellent place to understand the difference between dampness that's more humidity versus when it's starting to become formed. And really what I'm listening for is, when I hear the cough, can I hear that there's something blocking, or can I actually hear movement of water, and how thick or how viscous is the water? And so I would be looking for that. I also looking for the difference between somebody, a great example is, the Taoist Zangfu acupressure is a great place to experience the difference between formed and unformed, because you can have the sense that the belly is puffy and the digestion is off and the tongue is puffy, but when you touch the belly and you move the belly, they're not getting sloshy sensations. They're able to drink water, and water is not a culprit or an aggravating factor. And that's quite different than if someone says, oh yeah, water might make this worse, or when I drink water, it doesn't move, or when I touch them, I can hear sloshy. And so for me, I do tend to feel like if I can get a sense that there is tangible water, I'm often, and I'm gonna in this moment say maybe from like epigastric down, if I get the sense that there is tangible water in there, I do feel like I can maybe pee it out or poop it out by changing the quality of the pee or the bowels. Whereas if I feel like I can't hear the water and it's not making them have watery bowels, or they're not leaking of pee, or they're not leaking of damp, or like their skin isn't actually soppy, I can see a rash that I'm going to say is a result of humidity, but it's not actually wet. Then I'm going to be looking at things that are more transforming the water as opposed to thinking that it's going to exit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, if I could ask a follow-up question, then how would you distinguish between this kind of early stage damp accumulation, if I can call it that, and then something like chi stagnation? Like what?
Well, I think that's a great question, because often the best way, what we're really doing when we're saying we're moving humidity is, well, we're moving the chi, right? We're aromatic for the chi. And so it's the chi that's being moved. And therefore the dampness is resolved. And so you're right, it's often not that much different, that one causes the other. I think I would be looking for the other information in the intake of, is this a pattern of chi that has led to this, or is this kind of a more acute, like, oh, humidity came in. Everything short of an acute attack by humidity is probably a result of the lack of chi moving, really ultimately, if that helps.
And this is a fairly novel way of, I mean, it seems novel, obviously it's ancient, but like, where could I learn more if I wanted to?
In our great herb class next year. No, just kidding. I think a good thing to do is start looking at what the different scholars said about these herbs and start looking for what are the Chinese vocabulary words that they're using. Because I think a lot of the translation into English lends us to say this herb treats damp, and it doesn't say it treats damp how? Well, it leached the water out, it transformed it, it dried it, it aromatically moved it, or scattered it, or dried it from bitter is way different. So I think with your Chinese skill, that's what I would do, is start looking through, pick maybe Bancao Gonglu is a great place, just because it's going to have bits and bobs from from so many people of their commentaries, and start seeing like, oh, it's talking about, like, someone will say Qianghua, how does it do it? It's because of its incredibly aromatic that it is able to scatter out and move. As the result, because the treating of the damp is the result of the successful herb, of the successful choice of herb in the right person. It's not actually the action of the plant. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your question. So, Julianne, do we have enough time for 2 more questions?
Sure, no problem.
So Boris is going to ask another one, but before that, I'd like to ask
Okay.
my question. I'm a big fan of using Huangqi.
Huangqin. Mm-hmm.
Huangqi astragalus.
Oh, Huangqi.
For deficiency edema. Can you speak a little bit about that and maybe elaborate how you like to use it and what conditions, and what type of dosing of Huangqi as well?
Huangqi, sure. Huangqi is a really excellent herb to investigate its effects, because ultimately it's supposed to be sweet and mildly warm. I have found in modern practice, it's very stimulating. Huangqi is the one herb that I feel like if I give somebody Huangqi on Monday, they should tell me that they are noticeably more energized by Wednesday or Thursday. I feel like it is a fast acting herb. It's a powerful herb. And so that's a great analogy, maybe going a little bit back to, I don't know if it was Lauren or Boris, you asked about the chi and the damp, that in enlivening or increasing the chi or giving the body, I'm going to use this. It's kind of like Huangqi does this to the body, kind of goes, whoa, 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 whoa. Even to the extent that Huangqi can be quite irritating to some people and can make them really manic. So it has this great stimulating property that inherently gets water to move, increases the spleen's ability to move the water by kind of going like this to the body. And certainly, depending on what you're pairing it with, one of my favorites in this kind of context would be Huangqi with Yi Ren.
Yeah.
because the Huang Qi is going to be warming and stimulating, and then the Yi Ren can help seep out or drain out the water and lessen the water. Huang Qi and Fu Ling, obviously, super famous combination to do that. So Huang Qi is great to use. And I tend to turn to it when I know that somebody is not likely to Shanghua, because I do feel like that's kind of an easy, I have had a patient actually last week that was expressing she was so incredibly exhausted and please could I give her something, and she'd been reading about astragalus and really wanted astragalus, would I please give it to her? But she has quite severe skin rashes, and I said to her, I don't think this is good for you. I think that it'll make your skin rash much worse. And she said, please, please, I'm so exhausted, you have to help me. So I gave it to her in one bag, and now her skin rash is off the charts bad. Which was really, you know, she said to me, oh, it did what you thought it might. And I said, yes. And now, of course, we have to kind of clear out that. So that shows you how powerful and wonderful Huang Qi is to kind of get things moving, especially in a heavy bodied, overweight, pale, very American kind of constitution, where the pulse is weak and they need that oomph, you know, to get the water moving. I think dose wise, anywhere from 9 to 18 grams is probably pretty common in our pharmacy, depending on, you know, how long I'm going to give it to them and the health of the patient.
All right, fantastic, thank you. And I think we're gonna round it up, we're gonna end it with Boris, your second question.
Yeah, so one thing that I'm struggling with is when I'm seeing concurrent, you know, water or dampness, and then also clear
Yeah.
signs of blood stasis. And
Okay.
I'm sometimes having trouble choosing herbs because theoretically similar herbs should move both water and blood. And
Okay.
but practically when I'm looking at what, you know, previous doctors have chosen to use to treat these kinds of conditions, they'll use different herbs. They don't overlap as neatly as I would hope so theoretically, since they're both liquid substances that could sit around but should move around freely.
You mean different herbs to move the blood than they're using to move water?
Right, like, you know, because it's two completely different categories. Yet,
Yeah,
yet I've heard, like, you know, using Duhua instead, Duhua instead of Dangui potentially.
Sure.
I think I heard you guys mention that once.
Yeah, sure.
But practically, like, I'm sometimes hesitant to move blood if I see a lot of dampness. Somebody mentioned something like it could make the dampness symptoms worse. I don't. I don't want to clarify too much more, but just in general, when there's simultaneous like blood stasis, not from an injury, and dampness, how do you?
I think I would definitely say that there are herbs that are inherently more, their quality lends to them affecting the blood more than affecting the yin, or some that are affecting water in the sense of a pathology and getting it out more than saying create circulation within the veins or the vessels. I think that there are qualities that lend to one or the other, which is why something may be classified more as move chi than move blood, or move water than move blood. I think that you will find that if you use the herb that makes the right effect for the chi, but both of those situations would resolve. But the next time you bump into something like that and you have a couple of herbs that you're thinking about, send me the names of those herbs in that situation so that I can get a sense of what you're seeing and what you're thinking, and so I can help walk you through it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I think with that, that wraps everything up. Thank you again, Julianne.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you everyone for coming, and we're gonna do this, right?
Yay! Thank
you.
you, Thomas, again, and thank you to Camlo.
Okay, bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for attending.
Bye-bye.